Far from children's tales and simplistic portrayals, there existed a man named Noah. To understand him, we need to peel back the layers of myth and seek the historical figure, an individual embedded in a time and space brutally different from our own. He was not a fable character, but a flesh and blood patriarch who breathed the air of an ancient world, a world the scriptures describe as plunged into a deep and widespread moral darkness. Before being the captain of a monumental ark, Noah was a farmer, a man of the soil, the grandson of Methuselah, and the 10th in the patriarchal line since Adam. Ancient chronicles, like the book of Genesis, describe him with a powerful and defining phrase: a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. This was not empty acclaim. In a context of systemic corruption, being righteous was an act of silent and dangerous rebellion. Imagine the social pressure on such a man. In a society where violence and wickedness were the norm, his righteousness would not be seen as a virtue, but as weakness or arrogance. His days were marked by hard work, managing his family, and above all, a solitary spiritual walk. He walked with God in a world that had turned its back on the divine, an existence of isolation in the midst of a crowd. The narrative of Noah and the flood, the Ark of Salvation, begins long before the first drop of rain. It starts with a man's daily decision to maintain his integrity against the overwhelming tide of depravity. He witnessed a humanity that, according to the texts, had corrupted its way on the earth, where every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. This daily observation must have weighed heavily on his soul. This scene of moral decay was not just a backdrop, but the catalyst for all that was to come. Noah's righteousness did not make him popular. On the contrary, it set him apart, marking him as a stranger in his own land. It was this uniqueness that would attract heaven's attention, setting the stage for a call that would challenge logic, reason, and the very nature of the world he knew. The pre-Diluvian world Noah inhabited was radically different from ours. Ancient texts, including Genesis, paint a grim picture of a civilization that was technologically advanced for its time, but spiritually bankrupt. Violence had become endemic, a universal language. The phrase "the earth was corrupt and was full of violence" is not a poetic hyperbole, but an accurate diagnosis of a society in collapse, where brute force was the only recognized law. Extra-biblical sources and myths from various ancient cultures echo this memory of a time of chaos. Stories of tyrannical heroes and beings of unchecked power suggest a collective memory of an era of anarchy and oppression. In this environment, human life had little value. Empathy and compassion would have been seen as vulnerabilities to be exploited, not virtues to be cultivated. The very structure of society seemed designed to amplify the worst human impulses. The corruption was not only physical, but also spiritual. The biblical account mentions an enigmatic interaction between the sons of God and the daughters of men, an event that seems to have accelerated the downward spiral of decay. Regardless of the theological interpretation, the result was a society that had disconnected from its Creator, plunging into practices that were a direct affront to the divine principles of order and justice. Evil was not an accident, it was a way of life. And it was in this cauldron of wickedness that Noah had to raise his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Imagine the challenge of teaching values like honesty, faith, and respect in an environment that celebrated dishonesty, disbelief, and brutality. Every day was a battle to protect his family from the moral contamination that spread like a plague, a constant effort to maintain a small island of sanity in an ocean of madness. This widespread degradation formed the context for the divine judgment. It was not an arbitrary decision or a celestial whim. It was the inevitable consequence of a humanity that had reached a point of no return. God's sorrow, described as pain in his heart, reveals the depth of the crisis. It was a world that was self-destructing, and the only solution would be a radical reset, a purification by water. But how did Noah's lineage remain pure? Noah's integrity did not arise from a vacuum. He was the heir of a specific lineage, a genealogy that represented a current of hope flowing through an increasingly dark history. His ancestry traces back to Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, born after the tragedy of Cain and Abel. While Cain's line is associated with violence and estrangement from God, Seth's is marked by a crucial detail. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This calling on the name of God was a deliberate act of faith, a conscious choice to maintain a connection with the divine in a world that was progressively drifting away. Figures like Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather, are emblematic of this tradition. The Bible says that Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him away. This is an extraordinary statement, suggesting a spiritual intimacy so profound that it transcended death itself. Noah grew up hearing these stories. The faith of his ancestors was his legacy, a testimony that it was possible to live differently. Lamech, his father, prophesied at his birth, saying, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." There was a messianic expectation surrounding Noah, a hope that he would bring relief and rest. This spiritual heritage was his foundation. Amidst a culture of death, his family preserved the memory of creation, the promise, and the relationship with God. It was an oral tradition passed from father to son, a set of values that shaped him from childhood. He was not righteous by chance. He was trained, taught, and prepared within a clan that refused to forget its origin and purpose. Therefore, when God sought a man on earth to carry out his plan of judgment and salvation, he did not choose randomly. He found a man whose entire life had been a preparation for that moment. Noah was the final product of 10 generations of persevering faithfulness. And it was to this soul, forged in tradition and faith, that God revealed himself with an instruction that seemed, to any rational mind, a complete delusion. The moment of the divine call is one of the most dramatic points in Noah's journey. There were no angels with trumpets or spectacular visions described in detail. The communication was direct, clear, and absolutely terrifying in its simplicity. "The end of all flesh has come before me. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood." For a man from the interior, likely accustomed to a predictable life, this command was incomprehensible. Think about the magnitude of the revelation. First, the news of the world's end. Noah was informed that civilization, as he knew it, would be completely annihilated, not by war or famine, but by a flood of global proportions, a water catastrophe in a world that, according to many interpretations, may have never seen rain before, being irrigated by streams that came up from the earth. The very idea was alien. Second, the assigned task was monumental and, frankly, absurd. To build a ship of colossal dimensions, approximately 500 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 50 feet high, far from any large body of water. The logistics, resources, and labor required would be overwhelming. He was not a naval engineer or a king with an army of workers, but a simple patriarch with his family. Noah's initial reaction is not recorded, but we can imagine the whirlwind of emotions: shock, fear, doubt. Was this truly the voice of God or a product of his own mind? How would he explain this to his wife, his sons, his neighbors? The order demanded blind faith, a trust that transcended logic and human experience. It was an invitation to abandon sanity in the eyes of the world. However, Noah's response is what defines him. The text succinctly states, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. This immediate and unquestioning obedience is the turning point of the story. He did not debate, he did not negotiate, he did not ask for proof. He simply believed and began to act, taking the first step on a project that would consume the rest of his life and transform him into the architect of human survival. With the divine blueprint in hand, Noah and his family faced an engineering challenge unprecedented in ancient history. The specified raw material, gopher wood. remains a mystery to scholars. Some suggest it is cypress or cedar, trees known for their durability and water resistance. The search for, cutting, and transportation of enough logs to build a structure the size of a modern ocean liner would be a Herculean task. The Ark's dimensions were precise and functional, not fanciful. The length-to-width ratio of 6:1 is considered by modern naval engineers to be ideal for stability in rough seas. The three-story structure, with internal compartments, not only maximized space for the animals, but also provided crucial structural reinforcement to withstand the stresses of a global cataclysm. Every detail of the divine design had a practical purpose. Besides the wood, there was the issue of sealing. God instructed Noah to coat the ark inside and out with pitch. This natural tar or asphalt was essential to make the vast wooden structure completely waterproof. Obtaining and applying the massive amount of pitch required would demand an immense logistical effort, possibly involving heating the substance to apply it to every crack and joint of the colossal vessel. The physical labor would have been grueling and relentless. Day after day, for decades, the sound of axes, saws, and hammers would echo across the landscape. Noah, already over 500 years old, led his 3 sons in a construction marathon that would last about a century. It was a testament to physical endurance and perseverance, a project that consumed the life and resources of an entire family, all based on a promise. This was not just a construction project. It was an act of worship, a materialization of faith. Every beam cut, every nail hammered, was a declaration of trust in God's word. The ark became a visible monument to Noah's obedience, rising slowly as a paradox in the middle of a dry landscape, a ship waiting for an ocean that no one else believed would come. The construction itself became a silent prophecy. As the ark took shape, the loneliness of Noah and his family must have deepened. The construction of such a gigantic vessel on dry land would have been the spectacle of the region. Neighbors, travelers, and the curious would certainly come to watch what many must have considered the height of madness. Questions would turn to mockery, and mockery to open contempt. Noah became the butt of jokes, a symbol of delusional fanaticism. The Apostle Peter would later describe him as a preacher of righteousness. This implies that the construction was not a silent act. Noah likely explained the reason for his work to anyone who would listen, warning of the impending judgment and the call to repentance. His words, however, fell on deaf ears. Society, absorbed in its own corruption and arrogance, saw his warnings as the ravings of an eccentric old man. Imagine the psychological pressure on his sons and their wives. They not only worked tirelessly on a bizarre project, but also faced daily social ostracism. Their childhood friends, their business partners, their entire social network would have abandoned or turned against them. Maintaining family unity and purpose amidst so much scorn required extraordinary conviction, a testament to Noah's strong character as the leader of his clan. The Bible mentions no outside help. The monumental task seems to have been carried out exclusively by Noah and his 3 sons. This solitude in the task reinforces the narrative of their separation from the world. They were not just building a wooden ark. They were building an invisible barrier between their faith and the overwhelming disbelief that surrounded them. Every day, the choice was reaffirmed: trust God or yield to the crushing pressure of the world. This long and lonely journey of construction was a longer and perhaps more difficult test of faith than the flood itself. It lasted for 120 years, a period of grace that the world ignored. For Noah, it was a century of persistent obedience, hard work, and profound isolation. He became a stranger to his generation, a solitary builder preparing a salvation that no one, except his own family, desired or believed was necessary. The construction of the ark was more than an engineering project. It was the longest and most visual sermon in history. For 120 years, the growing structure served as a prophetic billboard, a constant and undeniable warning of Noah's message. Every added plank was a verse in his sermon, every hammer blow a punctuation in his warning. He didn't need to shout from a mountaintop. His work spoke louder than any words. Noah's message, as a preacher of righteousness, was twofold. On one hand, it was a denunciation of the violence and corruption that had saturated the culture. He called people to return to a standard of righteousness. On the other hand, it was an announcement of impending judgment and an offer of salvation. The ark was the tangible proof of that offer, an open door for anyone who wanted to escape the coming destruction. Salvation was there, available to all. The people's reaction, however, was one of total indifference and contempt. Jesus, centuries later, would describe the attitude of that generation. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. They were completely absorbed in their daily lives, blind to spiritual reality, and deaf to prophetic warnings. Life went on as usual, and the ark was just an eccentric curiosity on the landscape. This stubborn resistance highlights God's patience and human stubbornness. The 120-year period was not arbitrary. It was a time of grace, a final opportunity for repentance. The slow and methodical construction of the ark was an act of divine mercy, giving humanity over a century to observe, question, and ultimately believe. But the choice was to ignore the warning and ridicule the messenger. Noah's experience became an archetype for all future prophets, speaking the truth to an audience that does not want to hear. His faith was not validated by the conversion of the masses, but by his own obedience to God, regardless of the results. He preached to an entire generation, and in the end, only his own family entered the ark. A powerful story about faithfulness amidst ministerial failure by human standards. To fully understand the depth of the corruption that led to the flood, we must turn to one of the most mysterious and debated passages in the entire biblical text, the mention of the Nephilim in Genesis, chapter 6. The text states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, the result of the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. These figures are described as the mighty men of old, men of renown. The identity of the sons of God is the key to the enigma. One ancient interpretation, popular in Jewish texts like the Book of Enoch, suggests they were fallen angels who materialized and had relations with human women. This transgression of the created order would have unleashed an unprecedented form of evil and corruption in the world, a contamination that went beyond simple human sinfulness, reaching a genetic and spiritual level. Another interpretation, more common in later theological circles, proposes that the sons of God were the righteous descendants of Seth's line, while the daughters of men were from the ungodly line of Cain. The marriage between these two lineages would represent a collapse of spiritual separation, a mass apostasy where the faithful remnant became corrupted, resulting in a generation of powerful but tyrannical and godless leaders. Regardless of the interpretation, the appearance of the Nephilim is presented as the turning point, the final straw that sealed the fate of that civilization. Their presence is directly linked to the divine declaration that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. They symbolize the peak of human arrogance and rebellion, a society that produced heroes based on strength and fame, rather than justice and faith. The existence of these enigmatic figures adds a layer of mystery and gravity to the narrative of Noah and the flood, the Ark of Salvation. It was not just about ordinary people being evil. There were extraordinary elements at play, a corruption so deep that it required a drastic and definitive intervention. The purification of the world needed to be total, and the ark was the only refuge against this cosmic disorder. The time for warnings was running out. After a century of labor and preaching, an extraordinary event signaled that the time was near. The animals began to arrive. The biblical text is clear. Of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. The order was specific: 7 pairs of clean animals and birds, and one pair of unclean animals. The logistics of such a gathering would be impossible for one man. This was not Noah's doing. He did not travel the world collecting creatures. The text implies a divine action, a miraculous migration guided by the Creator himself. Imagine the scene from all directions, in an orderly and peaceful flow, animals of all kinds approaching the ark, predators walking alongside prey, desert creatures next to those from the forest, all moved by an instinct implanted by God, converging on the single point of salvation on earth. For the mocking neighbors, this sight must have been deeply unsettling. What was once a madman's project now became a supernatural spectacle. The parade of animals was irrefutable proof that Noah's words were not empty. It was the last and most powerful warning, a visible and undeniable sign that the natural order of the world was being divinely altered in preparation for what was to come. Inside the ark, the task for Noah and his family was to manage this floating zoo. The internal structure, with its multiple compartments, was designed for this, storing food and water for a journey of indeterminate duration, managing waste, and caring for the creatures represented an immense challenge. The survival of the entire terrestrial animal kingdom depended on the diligence and labor of those 8 people. The arrival of the animals marked the final transition from preparation to the execution of the divine plan. The ark was no longer a shipyard, but a living sanctuary, a miniature ecosystem containing the genetic future of the planet. For Noah, each creature that passed through the door was a confirmation of his faith and a reminder of God's promise. The stage was set. Only the final act remained before the storm began. The most solemn and definitive moment of the entire prelude to the flood arrived. After Noah, his family, and all the animals were safely aboard, something significant happened. The text of Genesis states with powerful simplicity, "Then the Lord shut him in." This was not Noah's action. The door of the ark, likely a massive and heavy ramp, was sealed by an external divine force. Salvation and judgment were sealed in the same instant. This act of God closing the door carries deep symbolism. On one hand, it meant absolute protection for those inside. Once sealed by God, no storm, no wave, no force of nature could violate that sanctuary. Noah's family was completely safe under divine care. The hand that protected them was the same one that would initiate judgment on the outside world. They were set apart for survival. On the other hand, the closing of the door represented the end of opportunity for those left outside. For 120 years, the door of the ark had been metaphorically open. Noah's preaching was a continuous invitation to enter. But at that moment, the time of grace ended. The decision was made. Those who mocked, ignored, and despised the warning were now permanently on the outside, facing the consequences of their unbelief. Imagine the sounds of that moment. The slow, heavy creak of wood, the final, dull thud of the door locking into place. Inside, a tense silence, the expectation of what was to come. Outside, perhaps the last laughs of scorn, which would soon turn into screams of panic. The ark became an impassable border between 2 worlds, one destined for life and the other for destruction. There was no turning back. 7 days passed in silence, a week of waiting inside the sealed ark, with the outside world continuing its routine of indifference. This pause was perhaps the final test of faith for Noah and his family. 7 days in darkness, trusting that God's promise would be fulfilled. It was the calm before the storm, the last breath of a doomed world, before the waters of judgment began to fall. On the 7th day, Noah's world fell apart. The cataclysm did not begin with a simple rain. The biblical account describes a dual-origin event, a cosmic violence that attacked the planet from above and below. On that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. It was a decreation, a return to the primordial watery chaos described at the beginning of Genesis. The springs of the Great Deep suggest a massive geological convulsion. Underground waters, perhaps superheated by volcanic activity, erupting through the Earth's crust with unimaginable force. Colossal tsunamis, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions would have swept across the continents. The dry land, the very symbol of stability, was breaking apart under humanity's feet, swallowed by waters rising from its own depths. Simultaneously, the floodgates of the heavens were opened. This was not ordinary rain, but a torrential downpour, a precipitation of never-before-seen intensity. For 40 days and 40 nights, the water fell incessantly, submerging landscapes, cities, and finally, the highest mountains. The combination of these two water sources ensured that the flood was swift, violent, and global, leaving nowhere to escape. Inside the Ark, the experience must have been terrifying. The deafening sound of roaring water, the impact of debris against the hull, the violent rocking as the vessel was lifted from the ground and began to float. In the darkness of the compartments, Noah's family and the animals felt the entire world being destroyed around them. Their survival depended entirely on the structural integrity of the Ark and the promise of God. This event, Noah and the flood, the Ark of Salvation, was not a localized flood, but a planetary baptism, a radical cleansing of the earth. The world that existed before was completely erased, submerged beneath the waters of judgment. For the Ark's occupants, the initial terror slowly gave way to a new reality. They were alone, floating on an infinite ocean that covered a lifeless planet. The journey was just beginning. When the initial tumult of the 40 days of storm ceased, a deep and eerie silence must have set in. The Ark now floated calmly on an ocean that covered the entire planet. For another 150 days, the waters prevailed. For Noah and his family, this was a period of confinement and reflection, a long and monotonous journey over a global cemetery. The magnitude of what had happened was unimaginable. The psychological impact on the 8 souls aboard must have been immense. They were the sole survivors of their species. Everyone they had known, friends, relatives, neighbors, the entire social fabric of their world, had perished. The relief of salvation was surely mixed with a profound sense of grief and loss. They carried the weight of being the bridge between the old world and an unknown future. Daily life on the Ark was a routine of tireless work. Caring for thousands of animals in a confined space required strict discipline. Feeding, cleaning, ensuring that different species coexisted peacefully, all in the dim light of the Ark's interior, perhaps illuminated by a single window at the top. This routine was essential not only for the survival of the animals, but also for maintaining the sanity of the humans, giving them purpose amidst the isolation. Noah's faith was tested in a new way during this phase. The active obedience of building gave way to the passive patience of waiting. He had no control over the Ark's destiny. There was no rudder to steer or sails to raise. His only task was to trust, wait, and care for what had been entrusted to him. Floating aimlessly, he had to believe that God would remember them and bring them to a safe harbor in a new world. This long journey was a crucial transition. It was not just about surviving the storm, but about being transformed by it. The family that entered the Ark would not be the same one that left. They were being prepared for the immense responsibility of restarting civilization. The time at sea was a period of purification and preparation, a necessary isolation, so they could face the challenge of an empty world. After months of floating, a significant event marked a change. The Ark came to rest. The text says it grounded on the mountains of Ararat. This was the first tangible sign that the waters were receding and that the ordeal was nearing its end. The sensation of solid ground beneath the hull, even if on a mountaintop, must have brought a wave of relief and hope to the confined passengers. To confirm the state of the outside world, Noah resorted to an ingenious method, using birds as aerial scouts. First, he released a raven. being a scavenger. The raven flew back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Its ability to feed on carcasses that emerged as the waters receded made it an indicator that land was reappearing, but was not yet habitable. Next, Noah sent out a dove, a bird with different habits, which needs dry land and vegetation to land and feed. The first time, it found no place to perch and returned to the ark. 7 days later, he sent it out again. This time, it returned in the evening with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak. This became one of the most powerful symbols of peace and new beginnings in all of Western culture. The olive leaf was definitive proof that life had returned to earth. Vegetation was sprouting again. The judgment was over, and renewal had begun. The joy and gratitude that must have filled the ark at that moment are hard to imagine. It was the visual confirmation of God's promise of preservation and a new start. Hope was no longer just a belief, but a tangible reality. Noah waited another 7 days and sent the dove out one last time. It did not return, indicating that it had found a permanent home in the new world. The reconnaissance mission was complete. The earth was ready to be inhabited again. With this certainty, Noah removed the covering from the ark and saw, for the first time in over a year, the dry surface of the land. The long aquatic exile was finally over. The opening of the great door of the ark was a moment of rebirth. After more than a year of darkness, confinement, and the constant sound of water, Noah, his family, and the animals stepped out into a transformed world. Imagine the fresh air, the sunlight, the profound silence of an empty planet. The landscape they saw was not the same one they had left. It was a washed, purified earth, devoid of any trace of the previous civilization. The scene was one of austere and, at the same time, terrifying beauty. A clean world, but without the familiar sounds of other people, cities, or human activities. The silence was the sound of their solitude. They were the only 8 human beings on the entire planet. The weight of this reality must have been overwhelming. On their shoulders rested the responsibility of repopulating and rebuilding humanity from scratch. Noah's first instinct was not to explore or build a shelter, but to worship. This act reveals the core of his character and the source of his strength. His priority was to acknowledge the sovereignty and mercy of God, who had guided them through the greatest catastrophe in history. Gratitude overcame trauma. Faith overcame fear. He built an altar, a sacred place in the desolate landscape. On this altar, Noah offered sacrifices of every clean animal and of every clean bird. This act of worship, the first in a purified world, is described as a pleasing aroma that rose to God. It was an expression of total devotion, offering back to the Creator a portion of the life he had preserved. This gesture of gratitude would become the foundation for the next phase of God's interaction with humanity. The exit from the ark was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. Noah and the flood. The Ark of Salvation transcends the event of the flood and becomes a narrative about new beginnings, responsibility, and the relationship between God and man in a post-apocalyptic world. Noah's family stood on the threshold of an uncertain future, armed only with their faith and a divine promise. God's response to Noah's sacrifice was immediate and profound. It was not just an acceptance of the offering, but the establishment of a covenant, a formal pact between heaven and earth. God promised in his heart that he would never again curse the ground because of man, acknowledging that the inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. He also promised that the cycles of nature, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, would never cease. This covenant, known as the Noahic covenant, was extended not only to Noah and his family, but to all flesh, including the animal kingdom. It was a universal pact, establishing the foundations for the continuity of life on the planet. The promise was unconditional, an act of pure divine grace. God was committing himself to preserve the world. despite the continued fallibility of humanity. To seal and perpetually remember this promise, God instituted a sign, the rainbow. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. The rainbow, a natural phenomenon of stunning beauty that appears after rain, was transformed into a divine memorial. The same water that brought judgment would now be accompanied by a colorful symbol of mercy and faithfulness. This moment was fundamental to biblical theology. It established the concept of covenant as the primary means by which God relates to humanity. History would no longer be marked by the risk of global annihilation, but by God's patience and preservation. The rainbow would serve as a constant reminder, both to humanity and poetically to God Himself, of His promise never again to destroy the world with water. Noah's altar, therefore, was not just a place of gratitude, but the birthplace of a new dispensation. Humanity was given a second chance, a renewed mandate to fill the earth and manage it. But now they would live under the arch of a promise, a visible testimony to the grace that triumphed over judgment, allowing the fragile human experience to continue to unfold. With the covenant established, the practical task of restarting life began. Noah, returning to his original vocation, began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. This simple act of planting was deeply symbolic. It was a declaration of faith in the future, a belief in God's promise that the seasons would continue and that the earth would once again produce. It was the first step in transforming a desolate world into a home. Noah's family faced unique challenges. They possessed all the knowledge and skills of the antediluvian world, but needed to apply them in a completely new environment. They had to identify fertile soils, retame the landscape, and build a new society from just 8 people. The divine blessing to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth was now a literal and urgent mandate. The family dynamic also changed drastically. Before, they were one family among many. Now, they were the entirety of humanity. Their sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, were no longer just children, but the future patriarchs of all the nations of the world. The relationships, decisions, and conflicts within this small family nucleus would have global and lasting consequences. The pressure on them was on an unprecedented scale. They were also the guardians of history, the only living links to the world that was gone. The responsibility of transmitting the story of creation, the fall, the corruption, and the flood to future generations rested entirely on them. Their narrative would become the foundation of the new humanity's collective memory, explaining its origin, its nature, and its relationship with the Creator who saved them. This initial period of reconstruction was a time of great potential, but also of great vulnerability. Humanity had been given a clean slate, an opportunity to start over without the corrupting influence of the previous society. However, the fundamental problem, as God Himself had observed, had not been eradicated: the inclination of the human heart. And this intrinsic flaw would not take long to manifest itself again, even in the life of a righteous Noah. Noah's story takes a tragic and uncomfortably human turn after the flood. The man who resisted a world of evil, who heard God's voice, and who built the Ark of Salvation, stumbles in a moment of personal weakness. The text reports that after planting a vineyard and making wine, Noah drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. This incident reveals a crucial truth about the human condition. Noah's nakedness in his drunkenness becomes the catalyst for a family crisis. His youngest son, Ham, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. The exact nature of Ham's transgression is debated, whether it was merely disrespect or something more sinister. But the reaction of his brothers, Shem and Japheth, highlights the gravity of the act. They walked backward and covered their father, refusing to look upon his shame. When Noah awoke and learned what had happened, his reaction was to utter a series of blessings and curses. He cursed Canaan, Ham's son, condemning him to servitude, while blessing Shem and Japheth. This passage has been historically misinterpreted and used to justify atrocities, but in its context, it appears to be a prophecy about the geopolitical destiny of the nations that would descend from his sons, with the Canaanite nations becoming subservient to the descendants of Shem, Israel. This episode is vital for a complete study of Noah's character, as it avoids hagiography. It shows us that not even the hero of the flood was immune to failure. The same person described as righteous and blameless was also capable of excess and shameful behavior. This serves as a reminder that biblical righteousness is not the absence of sin, but a general orientation of one's life toward God, despite personal failings. The patriarch's fall demonstrates that the flood purified the earth, but not the human heart. The problem of sin traveled on the ark with the survivors. The story of Noah and the flood, the Ark of Salvation, does not end with a fairy tale ending, but with the harsh reality that the struggle between good and evil would continue in the new humanity, planted by the seeds of a complex and imperfect family. Noah's final legacy is not just his survival, but his progeny. He and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are presented in Genesis chapter 10, known as the Table of Nations, as the ancestors of all post-flood humanity. This chapter functions as a kind of ancient ethnographic map, tracing the dispersal of peoples and the origin of the different nations of the known world at the time. From Japheth descended the peoples who spread along the coasts and islands, generally associated with the Indo-European nations to the north and west of Israel. From Ham came the peoples who inhabited Africa and parts of Arabia, including the Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Canaanites, who would become historical adversaries of Israel. Ham's lineage is complex, marked by both great empires and the prophetic curse on Canaan. The most prominent lineage in the biblical narrative is that of Shem. From him descended various Semitic peoples, including the Assyrians, the Arameans, and most importantly, the Hebrews through Eber. Noah's blessing on Shem, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, is seen as a prefiguration of the special role his descendants, particularly Israel, would play in the history of redemption, being the line through which the Messiah would come. The Table of Nations is more than a simple genealogy. It is a theological statement. It affirms the fundamental unity of all humanity, that all peoples, regardless of their language, culture, or location, share a common origin in Noah's family. This view was radical in an ancient world where tribes and nations often saw each other as fundamentally different and inferior. Thus, Noah's legacy is paradoxical. On one hand, he is the second father of all humanity, the source of our unity. On the other, his family was the seed of diversity and, eventually, of the division that would culminate at the Tower of Babel. The story that began with one righteous man and his family in an ark branched out to become the complex and often conflicted tapestry of nations that make up the world. The story of Noah and the flood, the Ark of Salvation, resonates far beyond the pages of Genesis, becoming one of the most powerful archetypes in human culture. The ark has ceased to be just a historical object to become a multifaceted symbol of refuge, judgment, and hope. Its image evokes the idea of a safe place amidst chaos, a sanctuary that preserves life against the forces of destruction. In Judaism, the story of Noah serves as a fundamental reminder of God's covenant with humanity and the importance of obedience to divine law. The Noahide laws, 7 universal commandments that, according to rabbinic tradition, apply to all of humanity, are derived from this narrative, forming an ethical basis for non-Jews. The Ark is a symbol of the Torah, which offers spiritual protection in a morally turbulent world. In Christianity, the Ark is often seen as a prefiguration of Christ and the Church. The Apostle Peter makes this connection explicitly, comparing the waters of the flood to baptism, which now saves you. Just as the ark was the only means of physical salvation from the judgment of water, faith in Christ is presented as the only means of spiritual salvation. The Ark, with its single door, symbolizes Christ as the only way to God. Islam also honors Noah, as one of the great prophets of God. The Quran narrates his story in detail, emphasizing his patience and perseverance in preaching to a stubborn people for centuries. The Islamic narrative focuses on Nuh's struggle against idolatry and corruption, and the Ark Safina is a symbol of Allah's mercy towards the faithful believers. The enduring power of this story lies in its ability to speak to the universal human condition. We all face personal floods, moments of crisis, chaos, and despair. Noah's Ark has become a metaphor for that which keeps us safe, be it faith, family, community, or hope. It is a timeless testament that even in the darkest storms, preservation and a new beginning are possible. At the end of this journey through the life of Noah, what remains is not the image of a perfect saint in a wooden boat, but the complex portrait of a human being called to a superhuman task. The first lesson that emerges is the power of perseverance in faith. Noah received no daily confirmation or applause for his work. On the contrary, he faced a century of ridicule, but remained steadfast in his obedience, teaching that true faith is manifested in constancy, not in acclaim. The second lesson is about the nature of judgment and grace. The story of the flood is not about an angry God capriciously destroying his creation, but about the inevitable consequences of a world that has completely divorced itself from its creator. And in the midst of this necessary judgment, grace manifests in the form of an ark, an escape route. Justice and mercy are not opposites, but two faces of the same divine holiness. The story of Noah also confronts us with the reality of human imperfection. The same man who was the channel of salvation for humanity also succumbed to weakness and personal failure. This teaches us that being used by God does not require perfection, but a willing and obedient heart. The biblical narrative is relentlessly honest about the flaws of its heroes, reminding us that hope lies not in human strength, but in God's faithfulness. Finally, Noah's journey challenges us to consider our own arks. In a modern world flooded by currents of information, ideologies, and social pressures, what serves as our refuge of integrity? What are we building day by day that can preserve us and those we love from cultural and spiritual storms? Noah's obedience may have seemed like madness to his contemporaries, but in the end, it was the only sanity left. The saga of Noah and the flood, the Ark of Salvation, is an invitation to look beyond the surface of an ancient tale and find profound truths about character, faith, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of chaos. It is the story of a survivor who teaches us not only how to face the storm, but also how to rebuild a world after the waters recede, living under the ark of an eternal promise.